for joining today's NetTalk. Warm welcome to all of you. We are excited today to dive into a thought-provoking discussion on today's topic, how political is Tanzania's Gen Z? This evening, we will explore the passion, voices, but also the influence of this dynamic generation. They also refer to themselves as internet natives. They grew up with the internet. So this is going to be an engaging discussion, and I am excited to introduce to you our two panelists, beginning with Elsie Eyakuze, who is an independent consultant and blogger for the Mikocheni Report based in Dar es Salaam. She has been instrumental, among other things, in amplifying youth voices across her platform. Elsie Eyakuze. You can wave so people can see who you are. We are also excited to welcome Abel Simon, a recent graduate in geography and environmental science from the University of Dar es Salaam. He is a proud Gen Z himself and brings first-hand experience and a fresh perspective on how his generation navigates the political landscape of Tanzania and maybe also globally. So these are our two guests. Now, Elsie sits in Dar es Salaam and Abel is right now in Dodoma. Abel, did you wave? So yeah, that's Abel Simon. During this talk, we are going to dive into this topic together with the panelists. But in case you have questions that are not similar to ours, you can write them in the chat. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat during this session. And at the end of the session, we pick some questions to be answered. Maybe some will be answered during the talk. Now, maybe perhaps a short background to the topic that we're having today. This topic resulted from the events that transpired in Kenya a few months back. That is mid-June. There were some protests going on in Kenya. This 25th, a youth-led protest started in Kenya, which primarily composed of the so-called Generation Z, as they were referred to. They stormed the Kenyan parliament to prevent the passing of a finance bill 2024 that would increase taxes. Those taxes were on essential goods and services. That means from cooking oil to bread, and also the digital platforms. And the digital platforms, that is where most of the young people generate most of their income, like that is the source of income. Now, taxing at those areas was not something that the youth would have. So they started this move in the face of unemployment and those proposed taxes. They organized themselves under the hashtag Reject Finance Bill. It also went on to reject the president. Yeah, so Elsie and Abel, I'm sure in Tanzania, you also got wind of these happenings in our neighboring country, Kenya. And the question here is, what impact did it have on Tanzanians? What did the Tanzanians say to these ongoing protests that were taking part in June and maybe partly of July as well? How closely linked are the Gen Zs in Tanzania? And could such protests also happen in Tanzania the same way they happened in Kenya, or maybe in a similar way? I would like to hear your opinion on this. And I would like to start with Abel, the Gen Z representative. What are your views on this?
Okay, thank you, mediator. On my view, the protests raised awareness, as most of challenges are similar to Kenya and also among the Gen Z generation in Tanzania. And these challenges emerge on the importance about civic engagement and also potential collective actions, as evidenced by the increased discussions around democracies, also the issue of governance, social justice, mostly through online debates. This is part of Tanzania, especially. The most Gen Z generation in Tanzania, they are not reacting directly. They are just discussing on online platforms. This Tanzanian Gen Z generation just doing or taking action, but it is more cautious due to the government or have put more restriction on political landscapes. So I can say that the protests in Kenya have also contributed or mobilized the majority in Tanzania to take a serious action on what issues which are not well concerning their social, political, and also economic hardships. But they are not involved directly, like what happened there in Kenya. They are just using a peaceful way, or they are just using online platform to show their response about this.
Thank you so much. Now, Elsie, what do you think? Would similar protests be possible in Tanzania as well? And maybe you can also shed a light on the reaction of Tanzanians to the protests.
I want to agree with Abel here that there was a reaction. We all observed, because Kenya is our closest neighbor in many ways, economically, politically. We mirror each other a lot and consume each other's news and culture and inspire each other. And I think that's why maybe people thought that Tanzanian youth would catch the fire from Kenya and do something similar. But that's the thing. Kenya and Tanzania are very different politically. And how the youth organized is also very different. So whereas in Kenya, I would say that young people feel as though they have a common cause as a generation across all the other divides that we usually put upon ourselves, whether it be religion or ethnicity and other things. I think that in Tanzania, that sort of collective consciousness is not very strong yet. Not necessarily because of divisions, but what happens, I feel here, is that when young people start to become conscious, they get recruited into political parties, and that can take them away from a vision that's united. So if you join political parties, that kind of channels you in a different way. And I agree with Abel that there is a form of repression in Tanzania that's not necessarily as overtly violent or visibly violent to the outside world, I think. But I suspect that we operate on a much more effective culture of self-censorship. It's more internalized, so there's a lot of fear. And I feel as though we have not done our youth a good service in that we haven't empowered them to know their own capacity very well. So I find that the few who are motivated, who are like leaders, they're easy to pick up and pick out. And it's sort of harder to get a movement going in Tanzania. So while there's a lot of dialogue and there's a lot of inspiration and a lot of learning, translating that into action here in Tanzania is still a challenge.
Okay, thank you very much. So maybe just to sum up, Elsie, you're saying there is a lack of cohesion of the Tanzanians Gen Zs, which was the opposite in Kenya. There was a common cause that is still missing. But one thing I would like to highlight before I get to the next question is that when they understood that this bill was going to be passed, they actually started creating awareness through the online platforms about the bill and their rights and what it meant to the citizen. The message was spread through social media, mainly TikTok. First of all, creating that awareness, telling the youth what it meant. And not only the youth, also the police force were addressed that it would also affect them. So the cause became not only through within the Gen Zs, but also within the society. Now, coming to this question, how well do Gen Zs or are Gen Zs in Tanzania informed on their rights? How well do they understand their rights and maybe responsibilities also towards the future or towards their lives? And are there any forms of political engagement outside of political structures? Because you mentioned that already. Some move to political parties, but are there also spaces outside of political party structures? Abel, would you like to take it on?
Okay, I can say that the most young peoples in Tanzania, they are varying widely, as those who have access to education and internet or digital platform are more knowledgeable about their civil rights and also political rights. But many still lack knowledge about their rights due to limited civic education, especially in a school system, and also limited media freedom, together with cultural norms. Many young people, they are just living about their rights through social media campaigns and community activism. That is my opinion.
Okay. Over to you, Elsie. How do the Gen Zs in Tanzania understand their rights, and maybe are they really seeing themselves as the Gen Zs also? You could also shed light on that.
I do think that there is an element of understanding that they're young, that their world is different, that generation Gen Z is facing both challenges and opportunities that are different than, say, even my own generation due to technology and how the world is working right now. And whereas I think they've accepted and understand their youth and position in society, I want to go back to the element of empowerment and as to whether they understand their rights. I would say that I don't think that we have created enough opportunities for them to understand all of their rights. Abel mentioned that it's due to poor civic education, and that's a big factor. But before you can even get to civic education, basic education itself is very poor. It's limited, it's of poor quality. We produce graduates all the time from primary school and sometimes even secondary school who don't have strong literacy skills. So I would say that that is one of the things that I find explains the difference between Kenya and Tanzania. With the Kenyan education system having been quite strong for a number of decades in comparison to Tanzania, which has grown its education system, public education, very slowly across a very large country, and not always done so with the quality that young people deserve. And the outcome is that sometimes perhaps we expect them to have skills and motivation that we have not equipped them with, that have been in a way denied them, even though it's their right. So if you deny a basic right like a solid education, the other rights that build up on that can be difficult to see.
Let me chip in on these reasons that both of you mentioned, the access part to education, to technology, and all these varying points. I would like to ask this maybe as a question that just popped up into my mind right now. Kenya is actually facing the same situations, the same problems that you just mentioned with the education system, with the access, yet they managed because, remember, the finance bill touched things that you deal with daily, their basics, cooking oil or bread, a daily need, and also the access to technology. You know, many people also in Tanzania are using the internet for income generation. Maybe there's something that hasn't hit Tanzanians hard enough for them to start a cause. Would you maybe agree with that theory, Elsie, and then Abel?
I would disagree with you strongly. As someone who works in media, one of the measures that I know people like me have, and I know travelers to Tanzania ask me about, and that's the circulation of newspapers. If you go to a newsstand in Tanzania, how many newspapers are you going to see and how many people buy newspapers? Although it's going down globally, this started happening to me even years and years ago. This is a way in which you can reflect how much society is consuming media, has certain kinds of actionable knowledge at their fingertips. We have a very different market than Kenya. So insofar as Kenya faces challenges with its education system, I do not think that we are facing the same challenges. I think our scale is vastly different. And I would also say that in terms of the repression that has happened when young people do try to rise up and say, we don't like this, it has happened in the past. It's not as dramatic, perhaps, and it's not a unified and sustained movement as what we're seeing now. But the last elections that we held, a lot of young people were out on the streets. And although media was suppressed, I think that if you look in the right places, you'll find a lot of young people trying to hang around voting stations and make sure that the election went well, and they got beaten up by cops. And so there is also sort of a silencing about what happens in Tanzania in comparison to Kenya, which may have to do with how open or closed our societies are to media, to scrutiny, etc. So I wouldn't say that the youth are not motivated. I can think of when we had a problem with the cashew nut pricing a couple of years ago under the late President Magufuli, with some government interference into the cashew nut market, which had terrible consequences for cashew farmers in the South. A lot of young people didn't take it lying down, not by any means, but the suppression was so brutal. The repression of the reaction was just so direct. And I think that sometimes is given as an example of what can happen to you if you protest what's going on with your livelihood. So I wouldn't say that we're on par with Kenya necessarily, but then I also feel like there's a lot that's maybe not known because it's not covered well or spoken about outside of our internal dialogue within Tanzania.
Okay, thank you. Abel, what is your opinion? Do you think that there hasn't been yet a big cause that touches the youth, that generation, that would make them unify and go against, like stand up for their rights? Let me put it that way.
Okay, you know, most of youth in Tanzania, they're just in protesting, but it is too submissive because the system first of the government, it restricts them much to protest directly. So this makes them not unify together and came out to rise or to protest directly, like what happened in Kenya. So the freedom on mass media, also the government have put more restriction on the laws and also some regulations. This makes them failure to unite together or in a popular scale to establish a large scale protest like what happened in Kenya. That is what I can say. But also on the part of Kenya, what happened to Kenya, I can say the presidents who entered during the ruling is he creates a source of conflict by raising the prices, especially on goods, and also the issue of taxes. As we know, most of youth, they are just facing the problem of unemployment or economic hardship. So when the president raises taxes, makes them reacting because they feel their economic situation is going to be harder than the previous time. That's what makes them to unite or unify and fight for their rights. That's what I can say.
Okay, thank you, Abel. Now, let me chip in these other questions. What opportunities are there then for young Tanzanians for political participation, if any?
Opportunities.
Yes.
On my view, I can say that the young people in Tanzania have limited opportunities for political participation, as many political speeches remain dominated by older generation due to belief that they are more wiser than the youth. However, their engagement is by youth organization, especially on social media's platform, and also civil society's program that's offered by the non-government organization, offer leadership training or scholarship for political engagement. Also, local government structures like youth councils, but their influence is still marginal often.
Hey, thank you. Elsie, what is your view, or what do you know? What opportunities for political participation are there for Tanzanian youth?
I think that the Tanzanian youth should forget about what previous generations have done and become creative and explore some avenues that we haven't seen before here yet. One of the things they need to do, in my opinion, is to stand for office. I've been wanting to people younger than me for over 10 years now. So if I see someone on the ballot who's young, I'm much more likely to go for that. So I think they should come out in force and also on purpose vote for people who are younger, who are of their own generation or at least close, or who are allies of the youth. I think that they should use the power of their numbers a lot more. So, for example, if they choose to boycott an election because they truly feel that it's unfair, they should boycott en masse so that the election is nullified. Or if they decide that they're going to go out and vote en masse, they should really come out and vote en masse and not leave it sort of, wishy-washy, and make their wishes strongly known. I think they've got strength in numbers. They've also got strength in technology. I can't think of immediate examples, but I feel that they can use technology to communicate and organize better, and perhaps use tactics by non-criminal activists online who know various ways to get their messages across to the government. I think those are sort of the creative tactics that they need to use. They need to use culture and the arts a lot more. There's a few artists who get their messages out there. They get banned all the time or they get harassed. I think that the youth should react very strongly whenever this comes along. And protesting doesn't always have to mean going out and waving placards around. If you know that that's dangerous, protesting can be a simple go slow. Absolutely refuse to participate in the economy for 4 hours and see what happens. So I think that my instinct is to be protective. I don't necessarily want them to shed blood for these freedoms that are rightly theirs. I don't want it to get to that point. And before it gets to that point, I think that they can exercise some creative means to show that in their strength in numbers, in their creativity, they can push the older generations to listen to them. I think that they can experiment with revolution that's not in the traditional ways.
Thank you very much. So safety first and creative ways in political engagement, that is something that is still a way, a possible way. Over to you, Abel. A keyword, technology. That's what Elsie mentioned. How does global networking and digitalization influence the political attitude of young people, maybe also around the world? Are there also any global networks in which Tanzanian youth are involved?
Global network and digitalization have influenced the political attitudes of young people worldwide, including Tanzania, where platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok allow them to participate in global conservation about human rights, democracy, and also the issue of economic justice. That's what I can say on my opinions.
Elsie, do you know or are you aware of any global movements where Tanzanian youth are part of?
I don't want to lie and say that I'm aware of larger movements. I think that regionally speaking, sometimes there might be organization-based movements. So I'm thinking of this one that's MSTCDC, the Danish organization. It's a global youth movement that tends to involve people from the global south, including Tanzanians. Regional initiatives around the East African community as well will involve youth. But these are, in my perspective, I don't want to say external impositions, maybe call them external motivation. In terms of Tanzanian youth themselves, I think what technology has done for Tanzania is burst the bubble. And that's really healthy because these days I like the way that young Tanzanians call us out when we're lying. They immediately say, stop lying to us about how well the economy is going, or if you go to school, you're just going to get a great job as soon as you graduate. The economy actually needs to grow. And they have much more of a chance at getting realistic information about what's going on in the world, and therefore resisting some of the promises and lies that politicians and other leadership might engage in order to secure their votes and their support. So I like that they've become less naive and more cynical. And I think that's one of the seeds that is going to help them eventually sort of unify, because they'll all figure out that they have similar motivations. So for example, Abel here, he graduated in, is it environmental science, something that didn't exist as a credible career when I was coming up, like who did environment? But this is something their generation is facing for real. It's been messed up and someone has to do that job. And I think they have that a lot more in common and may unify around things like that, and being able to share information on how this is a global issue is a strong element. I think will give them validity, will give them support, and yeah, something to unify. But in terms of joining global movements that are already there, I'm not really aware of it. Perhaps it's happening, but I'm not in touch with that.
Thank you for your honest answer, but also the other areas that you touched in. I have this other question beyond the global movement. In the Reject the Finance Bill of Kenya, there a topic also came up with the countries of the global south of Kenya borrowing money from the World Bank and being indebted. But then also the question of post-colonialism or neocolonialism raised up. Is that also something, or is it also a topic that is revolving around the youth in Tanzania? Post-colonialism, neocolonialism, or decolonization? Elsie, you nodded. I guess you have something to say about that. Is that a topic?
Yeah, I raised my eyebrows because I haven't heard those words in a very long time. So it took me back. I feel as though these were topics that were trending more when I was young. But that's not a bad thing, because I feel, and I could be wrong, Abel could correct me, but I feel as though African youth, including Tanzanians, are today much more global citizens than we were. So they're likely to feel that while there are these inequalities, there are kind of bigger issues that unite them in a generational way that kind of supersedes some of those divides. So I can see Abel collaborating with his peers in Asia and in Europe and in Latin America easily, and talking about how, yes, colonization and structural issues have got us here, but how can we, as citizens of the planet, overcome them and overcome our individual countries' problematic political situations? I see that happening a bit more reasonably and maybe more frequently than necessarily in my generation, where perhaps the fight was a little bit different. And I don't mean to mention that they're not aware of these structural problems. I just feel like they might have a different angle to them and see beyond mere black and white, to put it so crudely. I feel like they have a bit of more sophistication about how big the issues really are. And I think that with Kenya, some of that talk about the debts and the neocolonialism is so very direct, especially when they've got military being sent to Haiti to police the situation. They've got American bases in their country, things that we're not facing in Tanzania, frankly. We're not sending young soldiers much further than East Africa, I guess. So perhaps emotionally, there's a different impact as well.
Yeah. I now have a question in the chat that I would like to ask before time runs out. And this is a person who works or has a partnership in Zanzibar. And she's asking whether how safe social media is, in a way that how critical can you be on social media? And because sometimes, or during past elections, she said she experienced that WhatsApp wasn't working well, for example. And yeah, she's wondering whether it was by chance or by purpose. So, but maybe the main question is how safe is it to be critical on social media? Abel, would you like to answer that?
Can you start with Elsie?
Elsie. Abel said ladies first.
Thank you, Abel. I think that you have to take calculated risks when using social media to be critical. So it's much more open platform, evidently, than physical ones or traditional media. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have consequences. It doesn't mean that it's not a controlled space. And especially leading up to elections and during elections, most governments in the world have shown that that's when they tend to control the media the most. And there is such a thing as an internet kill switch. So yes, social media can get taken offline during what the government feels are critical moments, although it has never been admitted to in any public way. There's enough experiences, I think, in the general population that I think that we can say there's probably interference, which necessitates them, like I was trying to intimate, the use of creative means to evade that sort of restriction upon one. It's not always possible, but yes, I do think that social media should be used with care if you want to be critical, and that one should expect interference from interested parties.
Okay, there is a question that popped up now. Okay, how is the repression of the opposition a topic for the youth? The current repression. Are you aware of the repression of the opposition, Elsie and other? Elsie, maybe you want to tackle that question.
Yeah, so the opposition is currently having a lot of difficulty holding rallies. So, for example, they might not get police permits to hold rallies, or even if they do, those rallies can get interrupted on the premise that they're disrupting the peace or something of the sort. So, in effect, opposition parties haven't really been able to hold major public gatherings and to talk to the population in any meaningful way for a very long time. So that's, I think, the disruption that Mira is talking about, and other means in which they have been interfered with so that they can't actually do the work of a political party, which is to mobilize membership and action. So I think that there's a lot of young people who see this, they participate in politics through parties, so they're not outside of the question. They see this, they experience this. It's often young people who are at the receiving end of repressive measures. So that's not very good for them. It's not comfortable, it's threatening. And I feel that that is probably creating even more of the cynicism and resentment. I don't think it works in favor of the government at all. If anything, they're showing that they're willing to alienate Tanzanians who just want to express themselves or have the right to gather and whatnot. So I think it's just another way in which, perhaps, unfortunately, negatively, perhaps this is going to motivate youth to really think about the political reality and what to do about it.
I think we were on the final closing remarks, the impact of the Kenyan demonstrations.
So I think that the impact of the Kenyan demonstration has been a teaching moment for Tanzanian youth. And I think that it would be unfair to think that the apparent lack of action on the Tanzanian side means that perhaps they're not inspired and motivated. I actually think it comes from a place of very realistic understanding of what is and isn't possible within our own environment, and also the differences in terms of the things that we might want to fight for. However, I feel as though it's definitely opened up a lot of conversation. It's encouraged young Tanzanians to also think of themselves as Gen Z and to think about, like, what is it that we want? So they're thinking a bit more collectively. That hasn't translated into a movement per se, because it has to be something that genuinely comes from Tanzania. But I think that this is a lesson in our books that's going to inform our actions in the future. I will not be surprised if some of the tactics, the thinking, some of the preparation, and perhaps even, if things go well, some cross-border collaboration might happen as this generation seeks out its own political voice, its own political strength. And I look forward to seeing what they're going to do as they come up. And yeah, I just want to say to Abel, good on him for coming out and speaking. And it'd be great if he can drag more of his fellow Gen Zs into this, the habit of speaking publicly and engaging. So thanks for being here, Abel.
Thank you so much, Elsie. Abel, now, and the call from Elsie, you heard it. This is your chance now to say your final remarks on this topic, lesson learned, what are future prospects, and what are you generally thinking as a Gen Z?
Okay, as a Gen Z, what's happened to Kenya protests, especially this demonstration in Kenya? Also, it gives us, generation in Tanzania, a picture of responding to fight for our rights and also to know our responsibility on political issues. So as future generation, I can say that this young generation must or they need to participate more on the political issues, especially in voting or election campaigns. And also they have to contest so as to make some changes which will cope with the modern society and also makes them to reach their goals. That's what I can say.
Well, thank you so much. How do we clap online? Yeah, thank you so much for your time, for being with us during this NetTalk, for voicing out your views, your opinions, and also the good advice. I very much hope, this is to you, Abel, mostly, and your generation, that I'm going to see more faces of your generation in the next coming NetTalks. Elsie, you're also very much welcome to our NetTalks. This is a round of applause to you too, Abel and Elsie.
Okay, thank you.
Wishing everyone a good evening.